The scream tore through the pack house before dawn, and Damian Cross was on his feet before his eyes were even fully open. He crossed the room in 3 strides, threw open the door, and found only silence waiting for him in the hallway. No scream, no sign of anyone, just the cold morning air, pouring through a window that should not have been open. He told himself it was a dream. He told himself that for the next 5 years, and he was wrong every single time. The bed beside his was empty. The sheets on Elena's side were cold, as if she had not slept there at all that night, though he remembered her warmth against his back only hours before. Her boots were gone from beside the door. Her cloak, the gray one, with the frayed edge she refused to replace, was missing from its hook. There was no note, no scent trail leading out through the gate, no footprints in the frost-covered grass beyond the porch. It was as though the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her whole, leaving nothing behind but an empty side of the bed, and a silence that would follow Damian for the rest of his life. He searched the grounds first, moving quickly and quietly so as not to wake the rest of the pack house. He checked the training yard, the kitchens, the stable where she liked to sit with the horses when she could not sleep. Nothing. He checked the tree line at the edge of the property, the place where she used to walk alone in the evenings, needing space from the crowded halls of pack life. Nothing there either. By the time the sun came up fully over the hills, Damian had convinced himself that she would come walking back through the gate any minute, laughing at how worried he looked, telling him she had simply gone for an early walk and lost track of time. She did not come back that morning. She did not come back that week. By the 3rd day, the pack elders were already speaking of her in the past tense, the way people speak of something that is finished and does not need to be discussed further. Damian sat in the great hall and listened to them debate whether to send trackers after her, or whether it would be a waste of pack resources to chase down an Omega who had clearly chosen to leave on her own. The word chosen struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Elena would never leave without a word, not after everything between them, not after the quiet promises they had made to each other under the old oak tree behind the training grounds. But he had no proof. He had nothing but a feeling in his chest that told him something was deeply wrong, and feelings were not enough to convince a council of elders who had never trusted an outsider Omega in the first place. He sent trackers anyway, against the elders' wishes. He sent his best men into the forest, along the old trade roads, into the neighboring territories where rogue wolves sometimes passed through. They found nothing, no scent, no trace, no sign that Elena Ashworth had ever existed beyond the small room she had once shared with him and the handful of people who had bothered to learn her name. What Damian did not know, what he could not have known in those frantic first days, was that Elena had not walked out of that gate on her own 2 feet in the way anyone imagined. She had been taken in the dead of night by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, moving fast and silent through the shadows while the entire pack house slept undisturbed around them. She had fought, but not for long, and not loudly enough for anyone to hear. By the time the sun rose over the packlands that first morning, she was already miles away, bound and blindfolded in the back of a covered wagon, being carried toward a fate that no one in the Blackthorn pack would learn the truth of for 5 long years. The weeks that followed her disappearance were the hardest of Damian's life up to that point, though he did not yet know how much harder things would eventually become. He threw himself into pack business with a ferocity that worried even his closest advisors. He barely slept. He barely ate. He walked the halls of the pack house at strange hours, as if he expected to turn a corner and find her standing there, arms crossed, asking him why he looked so tired. He never did. The whispers started slowly at first, the way they always do. Someone had seen Elena arguing with a stranger near the market the week before she vanished. Someone else claimed she had been unhappy, restless, eager to leave a life that had never truly suited her. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling, until by the end of the first month, half the pack believed she had simply run off with some other wolf from a rival territory, tired of playing second to Damian's endless duties as future Alpha King. Damian never believed those stories, not truly, not in the part of himself that mattered most. But belief without evidence is a fragile thing, easily worn down by time and pressure, and the constant, gentle insistence of people who claimed to have his best interests at heart. The elders pushed him to move on. They spoke of duty, of the pack's need for stability, of alliances that needed to be forged if the Blackthorn Pack was to survive the growing tensions with the territories to the north. They spoke of Elena less and less as the weeks became months, until her name became something people avoided mentioning in his presence, the way people avoid mentioning an old wound that has never quite healed. He kept her cloak. That was the one thing he refused to let go of, no matter how many times his advisors suggested it was time to clear out her belongings and make room for whatever came next. He kept it folded at the bottom of a chest in his room, and on the nights when the silence of the pack house became too heavy to bear, he would take it out and hold it, breathing in a scent that grew fainter with every passing month, until eventually there was almost nothing left of her in it at all, just fabric and thread, and the memory of a woman who had once made an empty room feel like a home. What Damien could not have imagined in those long and lonely months was where Elena actually was during that time, or what she was enduring, while he searched empty roads and questioned frightened villagers who had nothing useful to tell him. She was alive. She was, against every terrible odds, still breathing and still fighting, though the fight had changed shape entirely from anything either of them could have predicted on the morning she disappeared. She had been taken by a small group of wolves loyal to a faction that had never accepted the growing power of the Blackthorn Pack under Damien's rule. A faction led by a wolf named Edmund Voss who believed that Elena, an Omega with no strong bloodline to protect her, was the perfect weapon to use against a future Alpha King who had grown too confident, too secure in his position. They had watched her for weeks before taking her, learning her habits, learning that she often woke before dawn and walked alone near the edge of the property, learning exactly when the pack house guards changed shifts and exactly how long the gap between changes lasted. It had taken them less than 4 minutes to take her from her bed and carry her out through a hole cut in the northern fence. 4 minutes that Damien would spend the rest of his life wishing he had somehow been awake to stop. Elena did not understand, in those first disorienting hours, why she had been taken, or what anyone wanted from her. She was not important, or so she had always believed. She had no title, no bloodline, no political value, beyond the fact that she shared a bed with a man who would one day rule over one of the largest packs in the region. It was only later, once the blindfold had been removed, and she found herself in a small stone room, somewhere deep in unfamiliar territory, that Edmund Voss himself came to explain, with a calm and almost gentle tone that frightened her more than shouting ever could have, exactly what role she was about to play in his plans. He told her that she carried something valuable inside her, though at the time she did not yet know if that was true. He told her that Damien Cross would tear apart every territory in the region searching for her once he realized what she meant to his future, and that Edmund intended to use that search, and everything that came from it, to weaken the Blackthorn Pack from within, long before any war ever needed to be fought on open ground. He told her, with the same calm and gentle tone, that if she ever tried to send word back to Damien, if she ever tried to escape or contact anyone from her old life, the consequences would fall not on her, but on the child she now understood she was carrying. Elena had not known, on the morning she vanished, that she was pregnant. She learned it in that cold stone room, delivered as a threat rather than the joyful news it should have been. And in that single terrible moment, her entire understanding of her own disappearance shifted. She was no longer simply a captive. She was a mother, whether she had chosen that role yet or not, and every decision she made from that point forward would be shaped by the need to protect a life that had not yet even begun. She did not cry in front of Edmund Voss, though she wanted to. She had learned, in her years living on the edges of a pack that had never fully accepted her, that showing weakness in front of people who wished to control you only gave them more power over you. She kept her face still and her voice steady, and she asked him only one question, the only question that mattered to her in that moment. What did he need her to do to keep her child safe? Edmund's answer was simple. She would disappear completely. She would never contact Damien Cross again, never send word, never allow herself to be found, and in exchange, Edmund would ensure that she and the child would be allowed to live, hidden away in a settlement far from any pack territory, where no one would think to look. It was not kindness that motivated his offer. Elena understood that clearly even then. It was strategy. A living Elena, hidden and silent, would drive Damien to distraction for years, would consume resources and attention that could otherwise be spent strengthening his pack, would leave him vulnerable in ways that a dead Elena never could. Edmund needed her alive and needed her gone, And those two needs happened to align perfectly with the one thing Elena wanted, more than anything else in the world: to keep her unborn child safe from harm. She agreed. She had no real choice, not one that would not have put her child directly in danger, and so on that same day, still weak and disoriented from the journey that had brought her there, Elena Ashworth made the hardest decision of her life. She would vanish. She would let Damien believe whatever he needed to believe, let the pack whisper whatever stories comforted them, and she would carry her secret alone into an unknown future, trusting no one, trusting nothing, except her own determination to keep her child alive. She was moved 3 more times over the following weeks, each location more remote than the last, until finally, she arrived at a small settlement tucked into a valley, so far from any recognized pack territory that most maps did not even bother to mark it. It was a place built by wolves who had been cast out from their own packs for one reason or another. Wolves with no bloodline worth protecting and no territory worth defending. Wolves who had learned to survive by staying invisible to the larger world around them. It was there, in a settlement with no name that anyone bothered to use, that Elena would spend the next 5 years of her life, raising a child that Damien Cross did not even know existed, carrying a secret that grew heavier with every season that passed. She thought about him constantly in those early months, in the quiet hours before her son was born, when there was nothing to do but wait and wonder and imagine the life she had left behind. She wondered if he was searching for her, or if he had already given up. She wondered if the elders had convinced him to marry someone else, someone with a proper bloodline, someone who would not bring the kind of complications to his life that she always had. She wondered, most painfully of all, whether he would have chosen differently if he had known about the child, whether the truth would have changed anything at all, or whether the distance and the duty and the endless demands of pack politics would have pulled him away from her eventually regardless. She never got the chance to find out, not for 5 long years, and by the time the truth finally reached him, it would arrive far too late to change the outcome that fate, and Edmund Voss, had already set in motion. 3 weeks before Elena disappeared, Damien Cross sat across from his father's oldest advisor, a stern gray wolf named Victor Lane, and listened to a proposal that would have changed the course of his entire life had events not intervened first. The Northern Territories, ruled by a proud and ambitious pack called the Thornfield Line, were growing restless. Their alpha had begun making quiet threats along the border, testing the strength of the Blackthorn defenses in small, deniable ways that stopped just short of open conflict. Victor Lane believed there was only one way to secure lasting peace: a marriage alliance between Damien and Serafina Thornfield, the Alpha's only daughter. Damien had said no immediately, without hesitation, and he had meant it. He already had Elena. He had chosen her, quietly and privately, in the way that mattered most to him, even if it had never been formally announced to the pack. He told Victor Lane that he would find another way to secure peace with the North, a way that did not require him to abandon the woman he loved for the sake of politics. Victor had simply nodded, the way older wolves nod when they have heard a young man make a promise they do not believe he will be able to keep, and left the matter alone for the time being. What Damien did not fully understand, in those weeks before Elena's disappearance, was how much pressure was building around him from every direction at once. The threat from the Thornfield territories was real, and growing more serious by the week. Reports came in of skirmishes along the border, of scouts caught trespassing on Blackthorn land, of increasingly bold messages sent by the Thornfield Alpha, demanding concessions that Damien was not prepared to give. He spent his days in meetings with his war council, poring over maps and troop counts, trying to find a path through the growing crisis that would not require him to sacrifice everything he had built. He spent less time with Elena during those weeks than he ever had before, and though he did not realize it fully at the time, she noticed every missed dinner, every night he came to bed long after she had already fallen asleep, every conversation cut short, because his mind was somewhere else entirely, buried in border disputes and troop movements, and the endless demands of a pack that expected its future king to put duty above all else. There was one evening, about 10 days before she vanished, that Damien would replay in his mind countless times over the years that followed, turning it over and over like a stone worn smooth by handling. Elena had come to find him in his study, later than usual, her expression tighter than he was used to seeing it. She told him she needed to speak with him about something important, something she had heard while walking near the market earlier that day. She had overheard two strangers speaking in hushed tones about a man named Edmund Voss, a name Damien vaguely recognized as belonging to a minor faction leader who had once tried and failed to challenge Blackthorn authority years earlier. She told him the strangers had mentioned her name, specifically, in a way that made her deeply uneasy. Damien had been exhausted that night, his mind still tangled in troop deployments and border negotiations, and he had listened to her with only half of his attention, nodding along, and promising he would look into it, promising he would ask his scouts to keep an ear out for any mention of Edmund Voss along the border routes. He had not asked her to explain further. He had not pressed her for details about what exactly the strangers had said, or why they might have mentioned her name at all. He had simply filed the information away as one more small concern among 100 larger ones, and returned his attention to the maps spread across his desk. Elena had left his study that night without pushing the matter further, though something in her expression as she walked out the door suggested she wanted to. Damien noticed it, even in his distracted state, and told himself he would make time for her the following evening, that he would sit down properly and ask her to tell him everything she had heard, without the pressure of border reports pulling his attention away. He never got that chance. The following evening brought a new crisis along the northern border, a skirmish that left 2 Blackthorn scouts injured, and Damien spent the entire night in emergency meetings with his war council, instead of keeping the quiet promise he had made to Elena. He would think about that broken promise for years afterward, turning it into a wound he carried privately, never fully sharing with anyone how close he had come to learning the truth in time to change everything. If he had only asked one more question that night, if he had only pressed her to explain exactly what she had heard, if he had only treated her warning with the seriousness it deserved, instead of filing it away as background noise beneath the louder demands of pack politics. The days that followed blurred together in Damien's memory, one crisis bleeding into the next, until the morning Elena vanished, arrived almost without warning, catching him completely unprepared, despite every quiet sign that had been building in the weeks before. He did not connect her disappearance to the warning she had tried to give him, not at first. It took him nearly 2 full years before the pieces began to fit together in his mind, before he finally understood that the strangers Elena had overheard near the market were almost certainly scouts for Edmund Voss, sent ahead to study her habits and plan the exact method of her disappearance. By then, of course, the knowledge came far too late to change anything. All it did was deepen the guilt that had already settled into Damien's chest like a stone he could never quite set down, a constant reminder that he had been given a warning and had failed, through distraction and duty and simple human limitation, to listen closely enough to save the woman he loved. In the months immediately following her disappearance, before that connection had formed in his mind, Damien's focus remained split between the search for Elena and the growing crisis along the northern border. Victor Lane raised the marriage alliance proposal again, this time with a note of urgency that had not been present before. The Thornfield territories were preparing for something larger than border skirmishes, according to Blackthorn scouts, and Victor argued that a formal alliance, sealed through marriage, was the only way to prevent a war that the pack was not yet prepared to fight. Damien resisted for as long as he could. He told the council that Elena might still return, that it was too soon to make permanent decisions about his future, while there was still a chance she was alive and searching for a way back to him. But the pressure did not relent. Reports of Thornfield aggression continued to arrive, each one more alarming than the last, and eventually, even Damien's closest allies began to argue that the survival of the entire pack outweighed the uncertain hope of one missing Omega's return. It took nearly 8 months of resistance before Damien finally agreed to meet with Serafina Thornfield, and even then, he made it clear to everyone involved that he was agreeing only to a formal introduction, not to any binding commitment. He told himself, in the quiet privacy of his own thoughts, that he was doing this to buy time, to prevent open war while he continued searching for Elena through every channel still available to him. He told himself the marriage, if it ever happened at all, would be nothing more than a political arrangement, a shield to protect his pack while his heart remained exactly where it had always been. He did not yet understand how difficult it would become to hold on to that private promise once the machinery of pack politics began moving in earnest, how each small concession would lead inevitably to the next, until eventually he would find himself standing at the front of the Great Hall on his wedding day, marrying a woman he barely knew, while the memory of Elena's empty side of the bed remained the only thing that still felt real to him in a life that had otherwise become a performance, staged entirely for the benefit of people who had never truly cared whether he was happy at all. 5 years had passed, and Damian Cross had become a man that even his oldest friends sometimes struggled to recognize. He sat at the head of the great hall now with the title of Alpha King fully settled onto his shoulders, a title his father had passed to him only 2 years earlier before retiring quietly to the eastern estates. The war with the Thornfield territories had never fully materialized into the disaster everyone feared, thanks in large part to the marriage alliance that had bound the two packs together in an uneasy but functional peace. Serafina Thornfield, now Serafina Cross in name if nothing else, sat beside him at every formal event, beautiful and composed and utterly distant, the two of them performing the role of a devoted royal couple, for an audience that had long ago stopped questioning why they never seemed to touch, never seemed to laugh together, never seemed to share anything beyond the careful choreography required by their positions. Their marriage had settled into a pattern early on, one that suited them both in its own cold way. Serafina had her own reasons for wanting distance, reasons she never fully explained to Damian, and that he never pushed her to reveal, respecting the unspoken boundary the same way she respected his refusal to ever speak about the woman whose portrait he still kept locked in a drawer in his private study. They ran the pack together, with a kind of efficient partnership, dividing responsibilities and presenting a unified front to their people. But the warmth that should have existed between two people bound together for life had simply never grown, and neither of them seemed particularly troubled by its absence. Damian filled the empty spaces of his life with work, the same way he had in the first raw months after Elena vanished, though the sharp edges of that grief had long since worn down into something duller and more permanent. A low ache that lived somewhere beneath his ribs, and rarely announced itself except in quiet, unguarded moments. He still kept her cloak. He had never told anyone that, not even Serafina, though he suspected she knew. The way people who share a house always eventually learn each other's secrets even without meaning to. He had stopped actively searching for Elena around the 3rd year, not because he had given up hope entirely, but because every avenue had been exhausted so thoroughly that continuing to search felt less like determination and more like a refusal to accept reality. His trackers had covered every territory within a week's travel of Blackthorn land. He had sent quiet inquiries to allied packs as far as the coastal regions, offering rewards for any information about a woman matching Elena's description. Nothing had ever come of it. No sighting, no rumor, no trace. It was as though she had truly vanished from the earth itself on that autumn morning 5 years earlier, leaving behind nothing but an empty side of the bed and a wound that never fully closed. The morning that would change everything began like countless mornings before it, with Damian reviewing border reports over a cup of tea that had gone cold before he remembered to drink it. A messenger arrived partway through his meeting with the War Council, interrupting the discussion with news that a group of trespassers had been caught near the eastern edge of Blackthorn territory, close to the old trade road that had fallen out of regular use over the past decade. Among the trespassers was a young boy, no older than 5, caught in the act of taking food from a supply cart left unattended near the border checkpoint. Damian would not normally have concerned himself with such a minor matter, the kind of small border incident that his guards handled dozens of times a year without ever needing to involve the Alpha King directly. But something in the messenger's tone caught his attention, a hesitation that suggested there was more to the story than a simple case of theft. He asked what made this particular incident worth interrupting a War Council meeting, and the messenger, choosing his words carefully, explained that the boy had refused to speak a single word since being caught, had shown no fear, despite being surrounded by armed guards, and had a mark on his wrist that one of the older guards recognized as belonging to an old and mostly forgotten pack bloodline. Curiosity, more than any specific suspicion, pulled Damian away from his War Council meeting and down to the holding room where the boy had been brought. He told himself, walking down the corridor, that this was simply the kind of thing an Alpha King should personally oversee, a matter of pack security that deserved his direct attention. He was not prepared, not in any way, for what he found waiting for him in that small stone room. The boy sat on a low bench, small and thin, but held with a stillness that seemed far too composed for a child of his age, especially one who had just been captured and dragged before a room full of armed guards. His hair was dark and unruly, and his clothes were simple and worn, clearly made by hand, rather than purchased from any market. But it was his eyes that stopped Damien completely in the doorway, freezing him in place before he had even taken a single step into the room. They were amber, a distinct and unmistakable amber that Damien had seen in only one other face in his entire life, a face he had spent 5 years trying and failing to forget. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to move, unable to speak, his mind racing through explanations that all felt inadequate the instant he considered them. It was a coincidence, he told himself. Amber eyes were not so rare that a random child could not simply happen to have them, but the boy's jaw, set in a stubborn line despite his obvious fear, carried the same shape Damien remembered so clearly, the same shape he had watched set itself in exactly that way whenever Elena disagreed with something and refused to back down. It was not a coincidence. Some deep and instinctive part of him understood that immediately, even as his rational mind scrambled to catch up. He crossed the room slowly, aware of the guards watching him with confusion at his uncharacteristic hesitation, and knelt down in front of the bench so that he was at eye level with the boy. He asked, as gently as his suddenly unsteady voice would allow, what the boy's name was. The boy said nothing, simply staring back at Damien with an expression that mixed fear and defiance in a way that felt achingly, impossibly familiar. Damien tried again, asking where the boy had come from, who he lived with, whether he had a mother waiting for him somewhere. Still nothing. The boy's silence held firm, though Damien noticed his small hands tightening into fists in his lap, the knuckles going pale, and he recognized in that gesture the same stubborn refusal to show weakness that Elena had carried with her every single day he had known her. He asked one of the guards to bring the boy something to eat and drink, and to treat him gently, with none of the harshness typically reserved for trespassers caught along the border. The guard hesitated, clearly confused by the Alpha King's sudden interest in what should have been a routine matter, but obeyed without question. Damien remained kneeling in front of the boy, long after the guard had left the room, studying every detail of his face, searching for anything that might explain the impossible resemblance staring back at him. It was the mark on the boy's wrist that finally broke through the last of Damien's disbelief, the mark one of the guards had mentioned earlier. It was small, faded, clearly some kind of old symbol rather than an intentional tattoo, the sort of birthmark that sometimes ran through certain bloodlines and was passed down without anyone fully understanding its origin. Damien had seen a mark like it exactly once before, on Elena's own wrist, in the quiet privacy of their shared bedroom 5 years earlier, when she had told him it was a mark her mother had carried too, and her mother before that, a small piece of family history that meant nothing to anyone outside their bloodline, but had clearly meant something to her. Damien sat back on his heels, his heart pounding in a way it had not in years, and understood with sudden and complete certainty that the child sitting before him, silent and defiant and impossibly familiar, was somehow connected to the woman he had spent 5 years trying to forget. He did not yet understand how, or why, or what any of it meant for the future that had already been so carefully arranged around him, but he understood, in that single frozen moment kneeling on the cold stone floor of a holding room meant for common trespassers, that everything he thought he knew about the last 5 years of his life was about to be rewritten from the ground up. Word of the strange encounter in the holding room spread through the pack house faster than Damien would have liked, though he had expected nothing less. By the time evening fell, half the household staff had heard some version of the story, most of them wildly exaggerated, about the Alpha King kneeling on the floor before a captured child and refusing to leave his side. Serafina heard the story from her own maid before Damien had a chance to explain it to her himself, and she came to find him in his study with an expression that was more curious than accusing, though there was a wariness beneath it that Damien recognized well after 5 years of careful, distant partnership. He told her the truth, or as much of it as he understood at that point, which was not very much at all. He explained the boy's eyes, the shape of his jaw, the mark on his wrist that matched a mark he had seen only once before, years ago, on someone who no longer existed within the walls of the pack house, except as an old and rarely spoken name. Serafina listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the way it always was when she was working through something carefully in her own mind. When he finished, she asked only one question: what did he intend to do about it? Damien did not have a clear answer. Not yet. But he knew he could not simply return the boy to wherever he had come from, without understanding the truth first. He gave orders that night for the boy to be kept comfortable and safe within the pack house, watched over by a gentle-natured guard named Owen, who had children of his own, and knew how to put a frightened child at ease without pushing too hard. He gave orders, too, for his trackers to retrace the boy's path back toward the eastern border, to find out exactly where he had come from, and who, if anyone, was missing him. It took 3 days for the boy to speak his first word inside the pack house, and when he finally did, it was to Owen, quietly, almost accidentally, slipping out during a moment when the boy had forgotten to guard himself. He said his name was Kian. Nothing more, not at first, but it was enough of an opening that Owen was able to slowly coax out more details over the following 2 days. Small fragments delivered cautiously, as though the boy had been taught somewhere along the way that saying too much could bring danger to people he cared about. He said he lived with his mother in a place with no name, a settlement tucked into a valley surrounded by hills, too steep for most travelers to bother crossing. He said his mother worked hard, tending a small garden and trading skills with the other families who lived nearby, and that she had told him many times never to speak to strangers about where they lived or where they had come from. He had broken that rule only because he had been hungry, and the food cart near the border checkpoint had been left unwatched long enough that he thought he could take a small amount without anyone noticing. When Owen gently asked the boy his mother's name, Kian hesitated for a long moment before finally answering, his small voice barely above a whisper. He said her name was Elena. Owen brought this information directly to Damien, who had been waiting in the adjoining room the entire time, unable to bring himself to conduct the questioning personally, for fear that his own desperate need for answers would frighten the boy into silence again. When Owen said the name Elena, something in Damien's chest seized so completely that for a moment he could not draw breath at all. 5 years of careful, guarded hope, 5 years of telling himself it was foolish to keep believing, collapsed all at once into a single overwhelming certainty. She was alive. Somewhere, in a valley with no name, Elena was alive, and she had a son, and that son had somehow found his way, against every impossible odds, directly into the heart of the pack house Damien had never stopped hoping she would one day return to. He wanted to leave immediately, to gather trackers and ride out that very night toward the eastern border, following whatever trail could be found leading back to the settlement Kian had described. Victor Lane, older now but no less firm in his counsel, urged caution. A hasty, poorly planned expedition into unfamiliar territory could put both Damien and the boy's mother at greater risk, especially if the settlement's isolation was intentional, a deliberate choice made to avoid exactly the kind of attention a search party from the Blackthorn pack would bring with it. Victor argued for patience, for careful planning, for gathering as much information as possible from Kian before committing to any course of action. Damien forced himself to listen, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to move faster. He spent the following days sitting with Kian himself, slowly building the kind of trust that Owen had already begun establishing, learning to be patient with a child who had clearly been taught caution as a survival skill, rather than a simple manner. He learned, piece by careful piece, that Kian's mother worked long hours but always made time in the evenings to tell him stories, that she kept a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their home, that she sometimes cried quietly at night when she thought Kian was already asleep, though he had learned not to mention that he noticed. Every detail Damien gathered deepened both his hope and his grief in equal measure. Elena was alive, that much seemed certain, but the picture emerging of her life over the past 5 years was one of hardship and isolation, a far cry from the comfortable existence she should have had within the walls of the pack house she had once called home. He wondered, with a guilt that grew heavier by the day, what had driven her to a place like that, what circumstances could have forced a woman he knew to be resourceful and determined into a life of hiding in a nameless valley, raising a son alone, with no support beyond whatever small community had gathered around her. It was Kian himself who eventually mentioned, almost in passing during one of their quiet conversations, a detail that sent a cold shock of understanding through Damien's chest. The boy said that his mother had once told him his father was a very important man, a leader of many people, but that they could never go back to him, because bad people would hurt them if they tried. He said his mother had made him promise, many times, never to tell anyone about his father, though he had never fully understood why the promise mattered so much until now, sitting inside a great stone house filled with more people and more wealth than he had ever seen in his short life. Damien sat perfectly still after hearing this, processing the full weight of what the boy had just revealed without fully realizing it. Elena had not simply disappeared on her own. She had been forced away, threatened in some manner serious enough that she had spent 5 years hiding not just herself, but their son, believing that returning to Damien, or even reaching out to him, would bring danger down upon them both. The pieces of the mystery that had haunted him for 5 years were finally beginning to fit together, and the picture forming was far darker and more deliberate than the simple story of an unhappy Omega, choosing to walk away, that the pack elders had encouraged him to accept all those years ago. He thought back, with a sickening clarity, to the warning Elena had tried to give him, weeks before she vanished. The strangers she had overheard, near the market, speaking a name he barely remembered. Edmund Voss. He had dismissed it then, as background noise beneath the louder demands of border politics. Sitting now across from the son he had never known existed, hearing confirmation that Elena had been forced into hiding by threats serious enough to keep her silent for 5 full years, Damien finally understood that his failure to listen that night had not simply cost him a conversation. It had very possibly cost Elena her entire life, as she had once known it, and had cost him 5 years with a son who was now looking at him with the same wary, guarded eyes his mother had once used to study a world that had rarely been kind to her. That night, Damien gathered his most trusted trackers and his war council together, and for the first time in 5 years, gave an order with the full weight of certainty behind it, rather than the fragile, fading hope that had guided his earlier, unsuccessful searches. They would find the settlement Kian had described. They would move carefully, quietly, with enough force to protect Elena and Kian from whatever threat had driven them into hiding, but without announcing their approach in a way that might alert Edmund Voss, or whoever else might still be watching, that the Alpha King of Blackthorn was finally, after 5 long years, coming to bring his family home. The journey east took 4 days, longer than Damien would have liked, but Victor Lane had insisted on a route that avoided the main trade roads entirely, cutting instead through less-traveled forest paths that would keep their small party hidden from anyone who might report their movements back to unfriendly eyes. Damien rode at the front of the group, with Kian seated carefully in front of him, the boy having grown far more comfortable in his presence over the past week, though he still watched the surrounding forest with a wariness that spoke to years of careful caution instilled by his mother. They spoke little during the long hours of riding, but the silence between them had become a comfortable one rather than a guarded one, and occasionally, Kian would point out small details along the trail, a particular bird call, or a break in the trees, that reminded him of paths he had walked before. Damien found himself studying every gesture, every small habit, searching for pieces of Elena in the way the boy tilted his head when he was thinking, or the way he pressed his lips together tightly before speaking, exactly the way his mother always had when she was carefully choosing her words. On the 3rd night of their journey, camped in a small clearing far from any settled road, Kian asked Damien a question that caught him entirely off guard. The boy asked, quietly, staring into the small fire they had built, whether Damien had loved his mother. Damien considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that whatever he said in this moment would shape how this child understood his own history for the rest of his life. He told Kian, honestly and without hesitation, that he had loved his mother more than he had ever loved anything else in his life, and that not a single day had passed in 5 years without him thinking of her. Kian was quiet for a long moment after that, and then he said, so softly that Damien almost missed it, that his mother had told him the same thing about his father, many times, especially on the nights when she thought he was already asleep. They reached the edge of the valley late on the afternoon of the 4th day, and Damien felt his chest tighten at the sight of it. A wide green basin surrounded by steep hills, exactly as Kian had described, dotted with small wooden structures that had clearly been built by hand, without any of the resources or organization of a proper pack settlement. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and figures moved between the buildings, going about the quiet business of a community that had learned to survive entirely on its own terms, far from the protection or the politics of any recognized territory. Victor Lane insisted on caution as they approached, sending 2 trackers ahead to scout the settlement before the rest of the party revealed themselves, wary of the possibility that Edmund Voss might still have eyes watching over the place, even after 5 years. The scouts returned within the hour, with news that eased some of Damien's anxiety, reporting no sign of hostile forces, only the quiet daily life of what appeared to be a community of exiled and displaced wolves who had built something resembling a home out of very little. Damien rode into the settlement himself, with Kian beside him and only a handful of guards trailing behind, wanting to present as unthreatening an approach as possible to people who had clearly learned to fear outsiders. The residents of the settlement stopped their work as the small party entered, watching with a mixture of caution and open curiosity, though a few of them broke into relieved smiles at the sight of Kian riding safely alongside the strangers, clearly recognizing the boy and understanding immediately that his disappearance 3 weeks earlier had been resolved without harm. An older woman approached first, her expression guarded but not hostile, introducing herself as Clara, one of the settlement's elders and, as it turned out, someone who had known Elena closely during her 5 years living among them. Damien dismounted immediately and asked, with a directness he could not soften even if he had wanted to, where he could find Elena Ashworth. Something shifted in Clara's expression at the question, a flicker of sorrow that Damien noticed immediately, and that sent a cold, sick feeling spreading through his chest, before she had even spoken a single word in response. Clara asked if they could speak somewhere more private, away from the gathering crowd of settlement residents who had begun to draw closer, curious about the arrival of armed strangers and the return of a child who had been missing for weeks. Damien agreed, though every instinct in his body wanted to demand an immediate answer rather than wait even a few more minutes for whatever Clara was preparing to tell him. He asked Owen to keep Kian close and comfortable, while he followed Clara toward a small wooden structure near the edge of the settlement, the one that Clara explained, in a voice that had grown heavier with each step, had once belonged to Elena and Kian. Inside, the small home was simple but carefully kept, a single room with a modest bed, a small hearth, and shelves lined with handmade tools and a few precious books that had clearly been treasured and reread many times over. Damien took in every detail of the space with a kind of desperate hunger, searching for any sign of the woman who had once shared his life 5 years ago, finding traces of her everywhere, in the careful, deliberate order of the room, in the small touches of care that had clearly gone into making a difficult life feel as much like a home as possible. Clara sat him down and told him, gently but without softening the truth more than necessary, exactly what had happened to Elena over the 5 years since her disappearance. She explained that Elena had arrived at the settlement pregnant and terrified, brought there by men working for a faction leader named Edmund Voss, who had threatened her with the safety of her unborn child if she ever attempted to make contact with Damien or return to Blackthorn territory. She explained that Elena had accepted this arrangement not out of any desire to leave her old life behind, but purely out of desperation to protect the child she was carrying, understanding that any attempt to reach out would put both their lives in immediate danger. Clara described the years that followed, the quiet strength Elena had shown in building a life for herself and Kian within the settlement, teaching herself skills she had never needed before, earning the trust and eventual friendship of a community that had initially viewed her, an outsider brought in under mysterious circumstances, with the same wariness they showed everyone new. She had raised Kian with fierce devotion, Clara said, telling him stories about a father who loved him, even though circumstances made it impossible for them to be together, always careful never to reveal enough detail that could put either of them at risk if the wrong person ever overheard. Damien listened to all of this with a growing dread building steadily in his chest, understanding from Clara's careful pacing, from the way she seemed to be building towards something rather than simply delivering information, that the worst part of the story had not yet been spoken. He asked, his voice barely steady, where Elena was now. Clara's expression softened into something that looked painfully close to grief, and she told him, as gently as such news could ever possibly be delivered, that Elena had died 2 years earlier. There had been an incident, she explained, a group of unfamiliar wolves who had wandered too close to the settlement's borders, likely scouts from a rival territory searching for resources or testing weaknesses in unclaimed lands. Elena, along with several other settlement members, had gone out to confront them and drive them away before they could discover the settlement's location and bring greater danger down upon the community. During the confrontation, Elena had been badly injured while ensuring the others, including several children who had wandered too close to the disturbance, made it back to safety. She had lingered for several days afterward, Clara explained, her injuries too severe for the settlement's limited resources to properly treat, though everyone had done everything within their power to save her. She had spent much of those final days with Kian, Clara said, her voice growing thick with the memory, making sure he understood how deeply she loved him, and making the settlement's healers promise to look after him, and to eventually help him understand, when he was old enough, exactly who his father was, and why she had never been able to bring him home herself. Damien sat in silence for a long time after Clara finished speaking, unable to fully process the enormity of what he had just learned. 5 years of searching, 5 years of quiet hope carried privately beneath the surface of a life built around duty and distance, had led him here, to a small wooden home, in a nameless valley, only to learn that he had arrived 2 years too late to ever see Elena again, 2 years too late to tell her himself how deeply he regretted every moment of inattention that had allowed Edmund Voss to take her from him in the first place. He asked Clara, his voice barely above a whisper, if there was anything left of Elena that he could see, anything that might help him understand the years he had missed. Clara nodded slowly and moved toward the far corner of the small home, kneeling down and lifting a loose floorboard that Damien would never have noticed on his own. Beneath it sat a small wooden box, worn smooth from handling, exactly the kind of hiding place a boy might mention in passing without fully understanding its significance. Clara handed him the box without a word, understanding instinctively that whatever it contained belonged to Damien now, a final piece of Elena that had been waiting, hidden and patient, for 5 years, for the day someone would finally come looking hard enough to find it. Damien held the box in his hands for a long moment before opening it, aware of Clara quietly leaving the room to give him privacy, aware of the low hum of settlement life continuing outside the small window, completely unaware of the way his entire understanding of the past 5 years was about to be rewritten one final time. The box was lighter than Damien expected when he finally lifted its lid, containing nothing more than a small collection of folded papers, a single pressed flower gone brittle with age, and a thin silver chain that Damien recognized immediately, having given it to Elena himself years earlier, as a simple, quiet gift, with no particular occasion attached to it. He lifted the papers out carefully, his hands unsteady in a way he could not remember them being in years, and unfolded the first one to find Elena's familiar handwriting filling the page from top to bottom. It was a letter, dated less than a month after her disappearance, addressed to him, though clearly never intended to be sent. She had written about the fear of those first weeks, the disorientation of finding herself suddenly torn away from everything familiar, and beneath the fear, an unmistakable current of love that had not wavered despite everything that had happened to her. She wrote that she understood why she could not return, that she had made her choice to protect their child and would make the same choice again without hesitation, but that understanding the necessity of her sacrifice did nothing to ease the ache of missing him every single day. Damien read through letter after letter, each one dated months apart, tracing the slow passage of 5 years through Elena's careful, changing handwriting. She wrote about Kian's first steps, about the way he had inherited Damien's stubborn determination, along with her own quiet resilience. She wrote about the friendships she had built within the settlement, about Clara's kindness, about the small satisfactions of a hard but honest life, built from nothing. And running beneath every letter, in every single one without exception, was the same unwavering thread of love for a man she had convinced herself she would never see again. Love that had never once faded despite 5 years of silence and separation. One of the later letters, dated only a few months before Clara's account, said Elena had died, struck Damien with a force that nearly broke him entirely. In it, Elena had written about a dream she'd had, one where Damien somehow found his way to the settlement and met Kian for the first time, and she described in careful, hopeful detail exactly how she imagined that reunion might unfold, the questions Kian would ask, the way Damien's face might soften at the sight of a child who so clearly belonged to both of them. She wrote that she knew it was foolish to hold on to such hopes after so many years of silence, but that some part of her could never quite let go of the possibility that fate might one day be kind enough to bring them back together after all. Damien sat with that letter for a long time, tears he had not allowed himself in years finally breaking free, understanding, with a grief so sharp it felt almost physical, that the reunion Elena had dreamed about, the one she had described with such careful, hopeful detail, had very nearly come true, had come true in every detail except the one that mattered most. Kian had found his way home. Damien had found his way to this valley, exactly as Elena had imagined, but Elena herself was gone, 2 years gone, and no amount of searching or regret would ever bring her back to complete the reunion she had spent 5 years quietly hoping for. He remained inside that small wooden home for hours, long after the sun had begun to set outside the small window, reading and rereading every letter, tracing his fingers over the pressed flower that Elena had apparently kept for reasons he would never fully know, holding the silver chain in his palm, and remembering the quiet afternoon he had given it to her, years ago now, back when their lives had still felt simple and full of possibility. Eventually Clara returned, gently checking on him, and found him still sitting exactly where she had left him, the box open beside him, and the letters spread carefully across his lap. She did not press him to leave, or to explain what he had found, simply sitting quietly beside him for a while, offering the kind of silent companionship that people who have witnessed grief up close often know how to give without needing to be asked. It was Clara who eventually told him more about Elena's final days, filling in details that had been too painful to share fully during their first conversation. She told him that Elena had asked, repeatedly during her final hours, that Kian be told the truth about his father someday, that he understood he had been loved by both his parents, even if circumstances had kept them apart. She told him that Elena had never once blamed Damien for what had happened, despite every reason she might have had to do so, understanding better than anyone the impossible pressures that came with holding power in a world where enemies were always watching for weakness. She told him, too, something that added an entirely new layer of urgency to everything Damien had learned that day. Edmund Voss, the man responsible for Elena's abduction and 5 years of forced hiding, was still alive, still active, and according to information the settlement had gathered from occasional traders passing through the region, still harboring ambitions against the Blackthorn pack that had only grown more dangerous in the years since Elena's disappearance. Clara explained that the settlement had learned to stay carefully hidden precisely because Edmund's influence extended further than most people realized, reaching into territories and alliances that made him a far more significant threat than the minor faction leader Damien remembered from years earlier. This information settled into Damien with a cold, clarifying weight, cutting through the grief that had consumed him for the past several hours, and replacing it with something sharper and more purposeful. Elena had died protecting her child and her community from threats that traced back, directly or indirectly, to Edmund Voss and the danger he represented. She had spent 5 years in hiding because of him. She had died, in part, because his influence had never been fully dismantled, allowing danger to continue circling the edges of her carefully built life, even after so many years had passed. Damien understood, sitting in that small wooden home with Elena's letters still spread across his lap, that his grief and his anger were about to become inseparable from each other, fueling a single unshakable purpose that would carry him through whatever difficult work lay ahead. He would bring Kian home, properly, as his acknowledged son and heir. He would ensure that Elena's sacrifice and her death were never allowed to fade into the same kind of forgotten silence that had swallowed the truth of her disappearance for 5 long years. And he would finally, fully, deal with Edmund Voss, ensuring that whatever remained of his influence could never again threaten anyone the way it had threatened Elena and the community that had taken her in when she had nowhere else to turn. He gathered the letters carefully back into their box, along with the pressed flower and the silver chain, and rose to his feet with a new steadiness that surprised even himself given the weight of everything he had learned that day. He thanked Clara, sincerely, for the years of care and protection she and the rest of the settlement had given to Elena and Kian, protection that Damien understood he could never fully repay, but intended to honor regardless, in whatever ways the settlement might need going forward. Outside, the evening had fully settled over the valley, and Damien found Kian sitting near one of the settlement's small fires, surrounded by a handful of children close to his own age, who had clearly grown fond of him during his years living among them. Damien watched him for a long moment before approaching, seeing in the boy's easy laughter with his friends a glimpse of the childhood Elena had worked so hard to build for him despite every hardship surrounding their circumstances. He knelt down beside Kian and told him, as gently and honestly as he could manage, what Clara had shared with him about his mother's final days, understanding that the boy likely already knew some version of this truth, but had perhaps never heard it spoken so directly by someone who had loved her as deeply as he had. Kian listened quietly, his young face carrying a solemnity that no child his age should have had to learn so early, and when Damien finished speaking, The boy simply leaned into him, resting his small head against Damien's shoulder, in a gesture of trust that meant more to Damien in that moment than almost anything else that had happened during the entire long and devastating day. They would leave the settlement in the morning, Damien decided, taking Kian home to Blackthorn territory where he belonged. But not before Damien made a quiet, private promise to himself, standing beneath the stars in a valley that had sheltered Elena through the hardest years of her life. He would honor her memory properly. He would raise their son with the devotion Elena had shown him every single day of his short life, and he would make certain that the truth of what happened to her, and the man responsible for it, would finally see the light after 5 long years buried in silence. The ride back to Blackthorn territory felt entirely different from the journey out, though the path was the same, and the days required to travel it had not changed. Damien carried Kian in front of him as before, but the silence between them now held a shared understanding that had not existed on the way out, a bond forged through grief and truth that no amount of time could have built on its own. Victor Lane rode close beside them for most of the journey, offering quiet counsel whenever Damien seemed to need it, though he mostly allowed father and son the space to begin building whatever relationship they were meant to have. Damien used the long hours of travel to think carefully about what awaited them back at the pack house, understanding that Kian's arrival would not be a simple matter of introducing a new member of the household. He was the Alpha King's son, born to a woman who had once shared Damien's life fully before circumstances tore her away, and his existence would immediately raise questions about inheritance, about legitimacy, about the careful political arrangements that had governed Blackthorn territory for the past 5 years. Damien knew the elders would not simply accept Kian's place without resistance, and he knew too that Serafina, whatever her private feelings, would have every reasonable cause to feel that her own position, and any children she might one day have, had been suddenly and permanently complicated. He decided, somewhere during the 3rd day of travel, that he would not hide from these difficulties, or attempt to manage them through careful political maneuvering, the way Victor Lane would likely advise. He would tell the full truth, publicly and without concealment, exactly as it had been revealed to him, that Elena had been taken against her will, that she had spent 5 years in hiding to protect their child from a genuine and serious threat, and that she had died protecting the community that sheltered her. Kian was his son, born of a woman he had loved completely, and no amount of political inconvenience would change the fact that the boy deserved to be acknowledged and protected as such. They arrived back at the pack house on a gray afternoon, and word of their return spread through the household almost instantly, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers to the courtyard, despite the guards' attempts to maintain some sense of order. Serafina stood near the entrance, composed as always, watching as Damien dismounted and lifted Kian down from the horse beside him. Damien met her eyes across the courtyard, and something passed between them in that silent exchange, an acknowledgement that whatever careful, distant arrangement had defined their marriage for the past several years was about to change in ways neither of them could fully predict. That evening, Damien called an emergency council meeting, gathering the elders, Victor Lane, and Serafina together in the great hall, to explain everything he had learned. He spoke plainly, without the careful diplomatic softening he might have used in other circumstances, laying out the truth of Elena's abduction, the threat posed by Edmund Voss, and the 5 years of hidden hardship she and Kian had endured as a direct result of a threat that traced back to enemies of the Blackthorn pack itself. He watched the elders' expressions shift from skepticism to discomfort as the implications of the story settled over them, understanding as clearly as Damien did that the pack's own failure to properly investigate Elena's disappearance 5 years earlier had contributed directly to the tragedy that followed. The council meeting stretched late into the night, filled with difficult questions about inheritance and legitimacy that Damien answered with a firmness that surprised several of the older elders, who had grown accustomed to a version of him that deferred more readily to their guidance. He made it clear, without room for negotiation, that Kian would be formally acknowledged as his son and recognized within the line of succession, regardless of any political complications this created. Victor Lane, to Damien's quiet relief, supported this position firmly, arguing that a pack that failed to protect its own would find itself weakened from within far more seriously than any external political inconvenience could threaten it. Serafina remained mostly silent throughout the meeting, listening carefully, but offering little in the way of visible reaction. It was only afterward, once the council had dispersed and the great hall had emptied, that she approached Damien privately, asking to speak with him alone. He expected difficulty, perhaps even anger, given everything the evening's revelations meant for her own position within the pack. What he found instead was a quiet, measured understanding that caught him entirely off guard. Serafina told him that she had always known, in some private corner of her awareness, that his heart had never fully belonged to their marriage, and that she had made her own peace with that reality years earlier, focusing instead on the practical partnership they had built together, rather than any deeper connection neither of them had ever truly expected to find with each other. She told him she had no interest in fighting Kian's place within the succession, understanding that the boy deserved far better than to become a casualty of politics twice over, first through his mother's tragic circumstances, and now potentially through a stepmother's resentment. She asked only that Damien be honest with her going forward about whatever changes this revelation might bring to their arrangement, a request Damien agreed to without hesitation, grateful beyond words for a grace he had not expected but deeply appreciated. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity, as Damien worked to formally establish Kian's place within the pack, arranging tutors to help him adjust to a life vastly different from the one he had known in the settlement, introducing him carefully to the wider pack community, and spending as much time with him personally as his duties allowed, determined not to repeat the pattern of distraction and neglect that had cost him so much time with Elena years earlier. Kian adjusted slowly, the transition understandably difficult for a boy who had spent his entire life in a small, close-knit settlement, suddenly thrust into the formal, hierarchical world of pack politics. But he found small comforts along the way, a growing friendship with Owen, who continued checking in on him regularly, and an unexpected but genuine warmth from Serafina, who, despite everything, found herself drawn to the quiet, watchful boy in ways she had not anticipated. Not everyone within the pack welcomed these changes gracefully. Word spread quickly of the true circumstances surrounding Elena's disappearance, and while much of the pack responded with sympathy and support for Damien and Kian, a smaller faction, particularly among the older elders who had originally encouraged Damien to abandon the search for Elena years earlier, grumbled privately about the disruption to carefully laid succession plans. Damien dealt with this resistance directly and firmly, unwilling to allow old political comfort to undermine what he now understood to be a matter of basic justice, both for his son and for the memory of the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect him. Amid all of this adjustment, Damien never lost sight of the second promise he had made to himself in that quiet valley, standing beneath the stars outside the settlement that had sheltered Elena during her final years. He began, quietly but methodically, gathering information about Edmund Voss, determined to understand the full scope of the threat that had cost Elena her freedom and eventually her life. Victor Lane assisted in this effort, drawing on decades of political experience to help trace the faction leaders' movements and alliances over the years since his original, minor challenge to Blackthorn authority. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture of a man who had spent the past 5 years quietly building influence in the shadows, forming alliances with smaller, disaffected factions throughout the region, positioning himself for some larger ambition that had not yet fully revealed itself. Damien understood, studying the reports his trackers brought back, that Edmund Voss represented a threat far more serious than the pack had ever fully appreciated, one that had already cost Elena her life, and that could easily threaten far more if left unaddressed any longer. He began planning, carefully and deliberately, the steps that would finally bring Edmund Voss's long campaign of quiet manipulation to an end, understanding that this confrontation, when it finally came, would need to serve not only as justice for Elena, but as a definitive statement to anyone else who might consider testing the strength of a pack that had, for 5 years, appeared distracted and vulnerable in the wake of its future king's private grief. That appearance of vulnerability, Damien now understood clearly, had never been an accident. It had been exactly what Edmund Voss intended all along, and it was long past time for that particular strategy to fail completely. The information Damien's trackers gathered over the following weeks confirmed what Clara had suggested during their conversation in the settlement, that Edmund Voss had grown into a far more significant threat than the minor faction leader most of the Blackthorn Council remembered from years earlier. He had built a network of alliances stretching across several smaller territories, each connection built on shared grievances against larger, more established packs. and each alliance carefully structured to keep his own name and influence hidden behind more visible, expendable figureheads. It was a strategy of patience and misdirection, the same strategy that had allowed him to orchestrate Elena's disappearance 5 years earlier, without ever drawing serious suspicion toward himself. Damien met with his war council repeatedly over the following month, working through the difficult question of how best to confront a threat that had spent years learning to operate invisibly. A direct military strike risked alerting Edmund Voss and allowing him to disappear further into the shadows, taking his network of alliances with him to some new hidden base of operations. A slower, more careful approach risked giving him time to prepare defenses or, worse, to strike first against a pack he clearly still viewed as a target worth undermining. It was Serafina, unexpectedly, who offered the piece of strategy that finally broke the deadlock in council discussions. Drawing on connections from her own Thornfield bloodline, connections that had access to information networks the Blackthorn Pack had never fully utilized, she proposed reaching out quietly to several of the smaller factions currently allied with Edmund Voss, offering them a path toward legitimate recognition and protection under Blackthorn authority, in exchange for information about his operations, and, crucially, their withdrawal of support at the critical moment Damien chose to move against him. Damien recognized immediately the wisdom in this approach, understanding that many of the factions currently allied with Edmund Voss had likely joined him not out of genuine loyalty, but out of desperation, having been cast out or overlooked by larger, more established packs, with little interest in extending protection to smaller, less powerful groups. Offering these factions a legitimate alternative, a path toward stability and protection that did not require them to remain loyal to a man whose ambitions had already cost innocent lives, proved far more effective than any direct military threat could have been. Over the following 2 months, Damien and Serafina worked together more closely than they ever had during their entire marriage, coordinating a careful campaign of diplomacy that slowly, patiently, drew away the network of support Edmund Voss had spent years building. It was strange, Damien reflected during quiet moments between negotiations, how this shared purpose had brought him and Serafina into a genuine partnership that their formal marriage vows had never managed to create, built not on romantic connection, but on a mutual respect that had grown steadily through months of difficult, careful work. Kian, meanwhile, continued adjusting to his new life within the pack house, his initial caution slowly giving way to a growing confidence as he built friendships among the other children and found his footing within the formal routines of pack life. He asked Damien frequently about his mother, and Damien made a point of never deflecting these questions, sharing stories from the years he and Elena had spent together before her disappearance, careful to paint a full and honest picture of a woman whose memory deserved to be remembered clearly, rather than smoothed over into something simpler and less true. He also began, during this period, the process of establishing a permanent memorial for Elena within the pack grounds, commissioning a small garden near the old oak tree where they had once made quiet promises to each other years earlier. He wanted a place that Kian could visit as he grew older, somewhere he could feel connected to a mother he would otherwise know only through stories and memory. A place that honored not just her death but the years of quiet strength and sacrifice she had shown in protecting their son against odds that would have broken many people entirely. By the 4th month after Kian's arrival at the pack house, the careful diplomatic campaign against Edmund Voss's network had succeeded far beyond what even Damien had initially hoped. Faction after faction had withdrawn their support, drawn by the promise of legitimate protection under Blackthorn authority, until Edmund Voss found himself increasingly isolated, his carefully built network of alliances crumbling away piece by piece without a single direct confrontation ever taking place. Reports began arriving that he had grown desperate, making increasingly reckless attempts to shore up what remained of his influence, attempts that only further alienated the factions he had once counted as allies. It was during this period of growing isolation that Edmund Voss made the mistake that would finally end his years of quiet manipulation entirely. Desperate to regain some measure of the influence he had lost, he attempted to reach out directly to remaining contacts within Blackthorn territory itself, hoping to recruit disaffected pack members who might be sympathetic to undermining Damien's authority from within. One of these contacts, an older elder who had grumbled privately about Kian's inheritance in the weeks following his arrival, but who ultimately valued loyalty to the pack over personal grievance, reported the approach directly to Victor Lane, providing exactly the kind of concrete evidence Damien needed to move against Edmund Voss, without any remaining ambiguity about his intentions or his guilt. Damien called his war council together immediately upon receiving this information, and this time there was no hesitation. No careful debate about strategy or timing. The evidence was clear. The network of support Edmund Voss had once relied upon had been thoroughly dismantled, and the moment had finally arrived to bring 5 years of quiet, hidden threat to a definitive and permanent end. The location of Edmund Voss's remaining stronghold, a fortified compound tucked into a remote stretch of hill country far from any recognized territory, had been identified weeks earlier through the careful diplomatic work Damien and Serafina had conducted, information provided by one of the many smaller factions who had chosen to abandon him in favor of Blackthorn's protection. Damien moved quickly once the decision was made, gathering a force large enough to overwhelm whatever defenses remained, but small enough to move with the speed and quiet coordination that would prevent Edmund from slipping away into hiding once again, the way he had managed to disappear so effectively for years. Victor Lane argued for caution even in these final stages, reminding Damien that Edmund Voss had proven himself a careful and patient strategist over many years, and that even a weakened, isolated opponent could still pose significant danger if underestimated. Damien took this counsel seriously, planning the approach to the compound with the same careful attention he had applied to every other stage of the campaign against Edmund's influence, coordinating his forces to arrive from multiple directions simultaneously, cutting off any possible escape routes before revealing their presence. The confrontation, when it finally came, proved far less dramatic than 5 years of anticipation might have suggested. With his network of alliances already dismantled, and his remaining forces vastly outnumbered by the disciplined Blackthorn force surrounding his compound, Edmund Voss found himself with no realistic path to either victory or escape. Damien entered the compound personally, flanked by Victor Lane and a contingent of his most trusted guards, determined to face the man responsible for Elena's suffering directly, rather than allowing the confrontation to happen at any remove. He found Edmund Voss in a modest study within the compound's central building, an older man now, his once ambitious bearing worn down by years of increasingly desperate maneuvering to maintain influence that had steadily slipped away from him. There was no dramatic struggle, no final desperate stand. Edmund seemed almost resigned, as though some part of him had understood for months that this outcome was approaching, even if he had refused to fully acknowledge it until Damien stood directly before him. Damien asked him only one question before allowing his guards to take him into custody, a question that had haunted him through every step of the long journey that had brought him to this moment. He asked why. Why target Elena specifically, an Omega with no political significance beyond her connection to him? Why choose a path of such calculated cruelty, rather than any more direct political challenge? Edmund's answer, delivered without any real remorse, confirmed everything Damien had already come to understand about the man's strategy. He explained, almost clinically, that a direct challenge against the Blackthorn pack would have been suicide, given the disparity in strength between his own resources and Damien's established territory. But a distracted, weakened alpha, one consumed by grief and uncertainty rather than focused governance, represented a far more vulnerable target, one whose weakened state could be exploited slowly, patiently, over years, rather than confronted head-on. Elena had simply been the most effective tool available for creating exactly that kind of distraction, valuable not for who she was, but for what her disappearance would do to the man who loved her. The coldness of this explanation settled over Damien with a fresh wave of anger, understanding fully now that Elena's 5 years of hardship, her forced separation from everything and everyone she loved, her eventual death protecting a community that had become her only refuge, had all stemmed from nothing more than cynical political calculation, a woman's entire life, and eventual death treated as merely a useful strategic tool by a man who had never known her at all, beyond her connection to someone he wished to weaken. Edmund Voss was taken into custody and brought before a formal council tribunal, where the full evidence of his crimes, gathered carefully over months of investigation, was presented publicly for the first time. The tribunal included testimony from several of the factions who had once allied with him, now willing to speak openly about the years of manipulation and false promises he had used to build and maintain his network. It included, too, testimony gathered from Clara and several other settlement residents, who traveled to Blackthorn territory specifically to ensure that the full truth of what Elena had endured, and ultimately sacrificed, was properly recorded and acknowledged. The tribunal's judgment was swift and decisive, stripping Edmund Voss of whatever remaining influence and territory he still controlled, and confining him permanently to a secure holding facility far from any position of power or influence, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to orchestrate the kind of quiet, patient cruelty that had defined his campaign against the Blackthorn Pack for the better part of a decade. For Damien, the tribunal's conclusion brought a measure of closure, though not the kind of triumphant satisfaction he might have imagined feeling in earlier, angrier moments during the long investigation. Justice had been served, certainly, and the threat that had cost Elena her freedom, and eventually her life, had been permanently neutralized. But no amount of justice could undo the 5 years he had lost with her, or give Kian back the years he should have spent knowing both his parents together, rather than growing up in hiding, learning his father's identity only through careful, guarded stories, told by a mother who never stopped hoping, against increasingly impossible odds, that they might one day be reunited. As the formal proceedings concluded, and the pack slowly began settling back into its normal rhythms, Damien found himself returning often to the small memorial garden he had commissioned near the old oak tree, the place where he and Elena had once made their quiet, private promises to each other so many years earlier. It had become, over the months since Kian's arrival, a place of genuine peace for him, somewhere he could sit quietly and feel connected to the woman whose love had shaped so much of who he had become, even across 5 years of separation and silence that neither of them had ever chosen. A full year passed after the tribunal that finally brought Edmund Voss's long campaign of quiet cruelty to its permanent end, and life within Blackthorn territory settled into a rhythm that Damien could not have imagined during those first desperate months after Elena's disappearance so many years earlier. Kian had grown steadily more comfortable within the pack house, his early caution gradually replaced by a quiet confidence that reminded Damien, more and more with each passing month, of the strength his mother had carried through every hardship of her own difficult life. He had grown close to Serafina in ways that surprised everyone who had watched their initially uncertain relationship develop, the two of them building a genuine bond that had nothing to do with formal duty, and everything to do with a shared warmth that had simply grown naturally between them over time. Serafina herself had found, in the months following the tribunal, a role within the pack that suited her far better than the distant, formal partnership she and Damien had maintained for years before Kian's arrival. She had taken an active interest in strengthening the diplomatic networks that had proven so effective in dismantling Edmund Voss's alliances, traveling occasionally to neighboring territories to build the kind of genuine relationships that made the entire region safer and more stable, work that gave her a sense of purpose independent of her formal position as Damien's wife. Their marriage remained, in its own way, exactly what it had always been, a careful and respectful partnership rather than a romantic one, but it had grown into something neither of them had expected, built now on genuine mutual respect and a shared commitment to Kian's well-being that had brought unexpected warmth into what had once been a purely political arrangement. The community that had sheltered Elena during her years of hiding had not been forgotten either. Damien had extended formal protection to the settlement, ensuring its residents no longer needed to live in fear of discovery by hostile forces, and Clara had become a regular and welcome visitor to Blackthorn territory, maintaining the connection between Kian and the community that had raised him during the years his father did not yet know he existed. Several settlement families had eventually chosen to relocate closer to Blackthorn territory once the protection was formally established, building new lives with far greater security than the Hidden Valley had ever been able to offer them. On a quiet afternoon in early autumn, exactly 1 year after Kian's arrival at the pack house, Damien walked with his son to the memorial garden near the old oak tree, carrying with them a small collection of wildflowers that Kian had gathered earlier that morning, having learned from Clara that his mother had always loved flowers of exactly that kind. They sat together beside the simple stone marker that bore Elena's name, and Kian, now old enough to understand far more of the story than he had during those first difficult weeks after his arrival, asked Damien to tell him again about the promises his parents had once made to each other, beneath this very tree, years before Kian himself had ever been born. Damien told the story slowly, carefully, the way he always did, describing the quiet evening when he and Elena had first admitted, hesitantly, and with more honesty than either of them had expected to offer, exactly how deeply they had come to care for each other despite the many differences in their circumstances and positions. He described her laugh, the particular way she used to tilt her head when she was amused by something he said, the stubborn set of her jaw whenever she disagreed with him and refused to back down, all the small details that Kian had never had the chance to witness firsthand, but had come to know intimately through years of careful, loving storytelling. He told Kian, too, about the mistake he had made in those final weeks before her disappearance, the warning she had tried to give him about strangers asking questions near the market, the warning he had been too distracted by pack politics to properly hear. He did not soften this part of the story or attempt to excuse himself from the weight of that failure, believing firmly that Kian deserved the full and honest truth about his parents' history, including the parts that reflected poorly on his father, rather than only the parts that painted a comfortable, simplified picture. Kian listened quietly, as he always did, and then asked a question that Damien had been waiting for, in some private corner of his mind, for the entire year since learning the full truth of what had happened to Elena. He asked whether Damien still felt guilty about not listening to her warning that night. Damien considered the question honestly before answering, understanding that his son deserved a truthful response, rather than a comforting deflection. He told Kian that yes, he would likely carry that guilt for the rest of his life, that some mistakes left marks that never fully faded, no matter how much time passed, or how much good work followed them. But he told him too, that carrying that guilt had taught him something important, that it had shaped him into a father who listened more carefully, who paid closer attention to the people he loved, and that in some strange way, his mother's sacrifice had made him a better protector for Kian than he might otherwise have become. They sat together in the memorial garden as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, father and son sharing a quiet peace that had been hard-won through years of grief and searching and difficult truth. Kian eventually asked whether his mother would be proud of the life he was building now, surrounded by people who cared for him, and a father who had finally found his way back into his life, even if the reunion had come far too late for the three of them to ever be fully whole together. Damien answered without any hesitation at all, certain of this truth in a way he had not felt certain of very much else during the long, difficult year since learning of Elena's death. He told Kian that his mother had spent 5 years sacrificing everything she had to give him a chance at exactly this kind of life, a life of safety and belonging and genuine love, and that nothing would have made her prouder than seeing her son sitting here now, healthy and happy, and surrounded by people determined to give him everything she had, once fought so hard to protect. As the sun set fully behind the hills surrounding Blackthorn territory, Damien placed his hand gently over his son's, both of them looking out over the quiet garden that had become, over the past year, a place of remembrance rather than simple grief, a place where Elena's memory lived on, not as a wound that never healed, but as a foundation of love and sacrifice, upon which an entire new chapter of their family's story had been carefully, painstakingly built. He had discovered the truth of what happened to her, far too late to save her, far too late to give her the reunion she had spent 5 years quietly hoping for. But he had not discovered it too late to honor her memory properly, to raise their son with the devotion she deserved, and to ensure that the love she had carried for both of them, even across 5 years of impossible silence, would never again be forgotten, or dismissed the way it had been in those first terrible weeks after she vanished without a word.